I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into this episode. Today, we're going to delve into an ongoing point of contention when talking about evidence of advanced technology in antiquity. Was it extraterrestrials or an ancient human civilization that was knocked back into the Stone Age? And to go into this topic, we're going to be speaking with Will Hart, the author of The Genesis Race, as well as his new book, Alien Civilizations. Will is a journalist, photographer, and filmmaker who has been investigating ancient mysteries and extraterrestrial intervention on Earth since the 1960s. So please welcome Will Hart. Hey, Will, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Rita. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm just glad to have you back on because I know that this is a topic that you are just so passionate about,
yes.
You know, especially since you've been studying, you know, the relationship between ancient civilizations and extraterrestrials. But let's start here. If you ask a mainstream archaeologist about evidence of advanced technology, they would say, "What advanced technology?" So what are we talking about here? What's going on in academia and part of this other ancient mysteries community?
Well, what's going on, maybe we have to back up a little here, okay. And let's look at what historians and archaeologists were saying, you know, 30, 40 years ago. And what they were saying was, all of a sudden, you know, in the Middle East there, in Mesopotamia, we had this agricultural revolution. Revolution means abrupt. And what they were really saying and implying there was, we can't figure it out because all of a sudden people were living in the Stone Age and then they knew how to do all these things like genetically manipulate seeds, build canals and irrigation. Because when you have agriculture, you have a whole different life. Create cities, and we don't have a logical progression, a visible progression of evidence showing how they did this. It just pops up. There it is, full-blown, full-grown, and they even used to use those words. Well, they don't do that anymore. You don't hear them use those terms. That's a no-no now. But the fact is, that's the way it happened. It abruptly happened.
Well, yeah, while you were talking, it just made me think of, you know, we have the site of Göbekli Tepe, which we know was buried 8,000 BC. So we can infer that the complex dates back further than that. What's interesting is that with this advanced construction site that we find here, which one is advanced technology, but we don't find agriculture tied to it. Or the very beginning of agriculture is tied to that location, but that's it.
Right. That's when you come up with anomalies, you know, the supposed anomalies. The anomalies are there because through, you know, academia, historians, archaeologists, anthropologists have put this evolution idea that everything goes from simple to complex, that we'll see this, you know, this series of tools get more and more complicated. But when we look at history, that's not the way that it happens. You can't have, like you just said, Göbekli has thrown the apple cart over because they, for years, insisted they had the chronology nailed down. That was 5,000 years ago. Everything started. Boom, there it is. Now they come up with this new site that, my goodness, people knew how to make sophisticated artifacts even 10, 11,000 years ago. How is this? Well, and guess what? For 20 years, they basically kept that from the public. It only came out in the last few years that this is a major thing. So they've been processing, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to present it to the public? But when you, to me, when you look at, if you look at Sumeria, what do you have in Sumeria? You have the sudden appearance of everything. That's why it's so crazy. Why would you have one culture? The Stone Age, when we look at it around the world, everything's the same. Stone Age tools, it's all the same. But all of a sudden, in this one culture in the Middle East, and the culture claims that they didn't create it, God's created it, we find them inventing everything. Bronze, agriculture, the wheel, writing. All of a sudden, no, you have to have antecedents. Where's the progression before it? Because that's the way human beings work. So we're not just coming up saying, you know, oh, there's ancient aliens, oh, the gods came, and it says so in the books and so on. We're looking at hard evidence. We're looking at a 20-story ziggurat. That required a lot of engineering, of architecture. They had uniform-sized bricks. Where did this all come from? How come there's not a 5-story first? Whoever heard of just jumping right up? Well, we didn't do it. You know, you don't have it in Egypt either. You have a 48-story Great Pyramid, and there wasn't another comparable-sized building until the 20th century, 4,500 years later. And I ask people, think this through. Does it make sense to you?
You know, and it's interesting that these cultures, you know, one was in Turkey, and then we have, you know, obviously the pyramids in Egypt. And you would think that a culture that was going to potentially advance would be more hospitable to civilization. I mean, Egypt, not, in my opinion, all that hospitable, and I don't really know what it is like in Turkey. I mean, you know, when you see pictures of Afghanistan and Iraq, I mean, it's a bunch of dirt. I don't know if it's any better in Turkey.
No, it's not. No, these are, and if you look at ancient Egypt, it was not a progressive society. It was an extremely traditional, hidebound society that resisted change in every possible way. And the fact is, the Egyptians did not revere the pyramids. You don't find it in their artwork. You don't find it in the papyrus. You don't find it anywhere where they revered pyramids. The pyramids were there. They had their own separate culture, and they looked at those like, well, the gods did that. We don't know what they are. In fact, by the time you get into recorded history, the Arabs there in Egypt were telling Europeans, we called that the House of Terrors. It was not a sacred place. This is all made up by Western historians. The Egyptians never held those things to say. They just looked at it as the gods built that. Every once in a while they'd go clean up the sand away because, you know, as we know, you know, the Sphinx was getting buried. The pyramids and things were falling apart, and so so we're down to this basic thing, you know, which you brought up. Aliens are human beings. The Egyptians didn't do it. They never claimed it. We know that it wasn't a tomb. We know where the tombs were. They're in the King's Valley. They look totally different on the inside than what the Great Pyramid or any pyramid looks like. So how do you claim something is something when you have no evidence to back it up? And they have none. Why does the public accept it? Just because some historian says it?
Because it's a fact.
Okay. According to him, it's a fact. and he'll tell you, I'm the authority and you're nobody. And I tell him, no, I'm a human being and this is my history too, and you're not going to lie to me. I'm not going to let you, because we are in the age of science now. You have to have proofs, evidence, and guess what? They've tried to rebuild the pyramid on a small scale and they failed.
They can't even like do 3 blocks without them chipping them, or they can't lift them, or they can't roll them on their sticks. It's humorous. It's humorous.
And they 3 different recorded times that I know of, they've tried to prove that they could use the methods and the tools, and they failed utterly. And yet you've got people, you know, popular author Graham Hancock and many others saying, well, it was a lost civilization that did it then. They'll agree. He'll agree. He'll go in and analyze it. Any number of authors will and say, no, the Egyptians couldn't have done this. They were Stone Age people. They didn't have the tools or the methods. And then leave it up to a lost civilization that they can't even identify. to me, it's like, well, okay, if there was a lost civilization, then since there were 103 pyramids and many, many temples would have required millions of tools over centuries and centuries, where are the tools? They couldn't, if they disappeared, the tools would still be there. Some evidence would still be there of them, and there's none. There's no evidence of any advanced tools. Yes, multiple sites.
I have to kind of take a step back and go, okay, but if you're talking about a lost civilization, the pronoun a, just one letter, a. But when you look globally at megalithic sites that defy explanation,
Peru, Bolivia,
you know, are we talking about a lost global civilization? I mean, what are we talking about here? So if you were to take not the extraterrestrial, but just take it was a global civilization, what would that potentially look like? I mean, how would you make that work?
you have to find evidence. You have to find evidence for it. My premise, working premise when I study any kind of artifact or site is, can I find the tools that match it? Right? It's just logical. If I have a great pyramid and I want to find, just like if we were out in the Amazon and we found a watch on the ground, we know we're from civilization. We look at the watch and go, no, they didn't make that here. That came from New York. You know, because we know automatically. They don't have the infrastructure or the factories and so on, the precision to make this watch here in the Amazon. I do the same thing with the Great Pyramid or anything else. You know, where are the tools that made this? If I can't find the tools, then I go, okay, humans didn't make it. That's why the tools aren't here. It's too sophisticated for the time. The tools aren't here. Somebody else made it. Now, anybody that wants to argue for lost civilization and lost technology has got to explain what happened to the tools. If you say that, well, there was a cataclysm and the culture got dispersed and lost, no, the tools still have to be somewhere in evidence.
Well, there are some people that say that, well, they were, they weren't made out of stone, and so they rusted, corroded, and are gone. But that also puts the question of dating. So if someone is going to, well, aliens, lost civilization, it doesn't really matter. So if you were going to date the pyramids, or if you were going to date Sacsayhuaman or Pumapunku or some of these sites that you see multiple times, what kind of a dating would you put on them?
Exactly. It's very difficult. I mean, how are you going to date stone? I think they claim to have some methods now, but I think they're kind of suspect. It would be a very new technology.
But I mean, if you were just ballparking your own, what's your opinion, I guess?
And how far back
the
artifacts we see are? Some of them in Egypt to me look very, very ancient because they are so, and I'm not talking about the Great Pyramid and the pyramids that clustered around there, because they don't look that old. But some of them, if you go out into the desert, look very old. They're completely collapsed. I mean, they've gone back into into dust and sand. Very old. Those in the range of 10 or 15,000 years or even more. Some of it doesn't look like, when I look at Peru, I don't see a lot of erosion. I don't see those things looking like that. If you look at Pumapunku, look at those stones. They don't look very eroded.
Mm-hmm. But it's also very dry there, too.
Yeah, and you're very high up and so on. And, well, it is in Egypt, too. And when they try to say, that, well, human beings went and carted off, no, they didn't. They didn't cart off all the stones. Nobody's climbing up a 40-story building to get stones, 2-ton stones off, when they can just go in a quarry and get them.
I heard this one theory from a gentleman a couple of years ago, which I thought was actually a pretty good theory, and then I mentioned it because I was interviewing someone on the show, and they were like, rah, rah, rah. And that Cheops, who supposedly built the Great Pyramid, didn't build the pyramid, But what he did was he put the casing stones on it, which in this gentleman's estimate could have taken 20 years if it was just the casing stones. Well, wait, but that's not my question, or that's not where I'm going. Has anyone ever looked at the stones that exist there now? I mean, they're limestone, but like Robert Schoch looked at the weathering on the Sphinx enclosure. Has anybody looked at the weathering on the pyramid rocks to see if those stones are actually older than the casing stones that are tied to them, just from an erosion pattern?
Yeah, I don't know. I've had a lot of questions about why, at looking at that pyramid, what happened? Why are those casing stones gone? And I can't buy the traditional explanation that people climbed up that, it's a 50-degree angle, climbed up that pyramid. Don't forget, when the casing stones were on there, they were smooth, and that was a very steep surface. Nobody's climbing up the side of that to hack on stone. So what happened? How did they get dislodged? And that is, to me, is a mystery. And you find it with all the pyramids, except the rhomboid pyramid. They call it the bent pyramid. You still do have the casing stones on that, and that gives you a pretty good idea of what it really looked like. Mm-hmm. The Great Pyramid looked like. But, when we come back to the issue of people just assuming, here's the thing that I would hold somebody's feet to, who tells me that human beings did that. I say, look, the largest block of stone that we have that we know was quarried and lifted and moved into place was 450 tons in Egypt. Now, you have to explain that one. They can't explain it. We didn't have any crane that would lift 450 tons until the space shuttle, and they built a custom-made crane that could lift that. Human beings could not possibly move manually, lift up out of a quarry 450 tons. It's impossible. If somebody won't admit that, then I can't argue with them because they're not scientific. Mm-hmm. They're holding on to a belief system, and the belief system is really, you got a belief system that human beings, why, then I would say, well, why did we bother, if human beings could build the Great Pyramid, why did we bother creating, and this whole civilization and machinery and an infrastructure to do the things that they did 4,000 years ago? We could do this tomorrow. And my challenge to anybody in that camp is, set it up, let's do it tomorrow. All you need is a group of day laborers to go pick up multi-ton stones. Can they do it?
No.
Nobody's going to try it. So what we're talking about then is people with a dogma, with almost a religious belief.
But if you let go of that date and go back to, and I'm going to say lost civilization, I'm going to make the assumption that when they say lost civilization, they are talking about a pre-Devonian civilization, that there was a culture that existed prior to the flood. And I don't even like saying prior to the flood, but I'm just going to use that because there's enough people that will say that had this advanced technology that got knocked into the Stone Age, and then we're the remnants of that culture.
I just want to know where, what the bottom line is, and if there was such a culture, you also have to then bring in the other side of it. I have already said that human beings couldn't do that unless, what technology could they have possessed to do the things we've seen? Now, okay, who built the Great Pyramid then? That civilization? Then that civilization, when did they get lost? 4,000 years ago? Well, nobody else got lost.
Well, but if they were pre-flood, from what I understand, the argument has been, that civilization experienced a major catastrophe and it kind of wiped them out. And
we're talking about Atlantis, basically. It's not really Atlantis.
Yeah.
Well, there's,
I mean, I don't like saying that word, but
there's a lot of
that theory, that concept, yes.
But you come back to the points that, then why you still have to realize that if Graham Hancock for instance, wants to argue that, he's also embracing the arguments that conventional historians use, which is that our ancestors who said they didn't do these things actually did do them. But our ancestors said they didn't. The Sumerians don't claim to have built anything. The Egyptians never said they built the Great Pyramids. Our academics recently, within the last couple of hundred years, claim that for them. You're buying into that argument and basically trashing out everything, calling it myth and make-believe and all this stuff. And to me, that makes no sense, and I'm not willing to do it. I'm not willing to disrespect what my ancestors, your ancestors, everybody said about their own history to take the word of some guy who wasn't there, who's got a degree on the wall and claims to be an expert. So what? I want the facts. And if it's tough and hardcore to get to them, well, let's get to them. I'm tired of the mealy-mouse stuff and mincing around these things. You want to debate it? Let's debate it. Ancient aliens, our ancestors said, did it. Lost civilization? What lost civilization?
The ones that got deified into the gods. You know, those guys.
The gods were, to me, if there's only two things you got to do to understand it. One is modern academics claim that gods meant mythological fantasy beings. They didn't exist. Our ancestors actually said advanced beings. If you take it as advanced beings, God makes sense. And even Plato said, when he talked about Atlantis, he said first the gods went on Atlantis, built temples, and they had to be pyramids and so on. Then they brought human beings into the picture. That's what Plato actually said. So he's agreeing also with all of the... Now, they'll look up at Plato and go, he was a wonderful philosopher, but boy, did he lie about history. Oh, really? Well, then throw him totally out, not part way, because I don't trust him if you think that. Because he said it was real. So you go ahead, line yourself up with what really makes sense and is coherent in the argument. Now, because if you're going to say lost civilizations and lost technology and then say, well, everything just disappeared. The people disappeared, nobody remembered, they can't give you this. No, they're giving you the history. The history was Atlantis, it sank, people went to North Africa, they went to Europe, we have genetic evidence, we have the Berbers, we have the Basques, we have cave art. What does it show? It shows alien beings.
Hi, this is Dr. Rita Louise. We hope you've been enjoying the program today. If you'd like to hear more from this guest or other guests we've had on the show, please visit www.justenergyradio.com.